Okay, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Lynette Ong. I'm Director of the China Governance Lab at the Munk School of Global Affairs. So let me do some land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Very pleased to have with us today Professor Fiona Cunningham. We are going to be discussing her new book, China's Information Age, Weapons in International Security, and also very pleased to have Professor Danny Nadal from the University of Toronto joining us as the discussant. So let me introduce both of them. Professor Cunningham is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also a faculty fellow at Perry World House, and he's also affiliated with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and the Christopher Brown Center for International Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. Fiona's research interests lie at the intersection of technology and international security with an empirical focus on China. So her first book, which is the book that she will discuss today, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security, examines China's distinctive approach to the dilemma of coercing an adversary under the shadow of nuclear war, which relies on substitutes for nuclear threats. So this is a very hot topic right now. Professor Danny Nadal, who is our discussant today, he is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, jointly appointed at the Department of Political Science and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. His research focuses on topics of global security and international order. He's currently writing a book entitled Urban Warfare and Urban Peace, exploring the relationship between urban geography and interstate conflicts. His work has been published in various peer-reviewed journals, books, and outlets aimed at policy makers as well as the broader public. I should say that if you're interested in buying Fiona's book, it is Under the Nuclear Shadow. It is available on Amazon. We can post a link on the chat. And you can also check out Professor Nadal's work by checking out his website at the Munk School. So on that note, over to you, Fiona.
So thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Professor Ong. Thank you very much to Professor Nadal for also discussing the book. And I also want to thank the China Governance Lab and the Asian Institute at the Munk School for making the event happen. I'll share my slide deck now to go with my talk. Can everyone see that? Okay, so I am absolutely thrilled to be here this afternoon virtually with you to share some of the highlights of my book, Under the Nuclear Shadow, China's Information Age Weapons in International Security. It was published by Princeton University Press last year. And this book is about what makes China's approach to strategic deterrence in the post-Cold War era different from other countries, different from other powers, and how we can use that difference to better understand broader issues in international relations, such as how technological change is affecting militaries around the globe, and also what is driving some of China's foreign policy choices. So I'll take about 30 minutes to give you a sense of what the book is about and why you should read it. I'll begin by introducing three big ideas in the book, which are the limited war dilemma, which is the problem at the core of the book and that tees up its research question, strategic substitution, which is one way of coping with that problem of the limited war dilemma, information age weapons, which are a means of implementing strategic substitution as a way of coping with that problem of the limited war dilemma. I'll then offer a theory of strategic substitution that explains why a country like China might choose this particular way of coping with the limited war dilemma. I'll talk you through the research design that I used in the book to write the empirical chapters and some of the key sources. And I'll give you a taste of what's in those empirical chapters talking you through decision-making in the post-Cold War era about China's nuclear weapons, its precision conventional missiles, offensive cyber operations, and counterspace capabilities. And then I'll wrap up at the end with my evaluation of China's foreign policy choices over the past 25 years or so, and highlight some of the book's contributions to the international relations scholarship, as well as scholarship on Chinese foreign policy. So this book is about how nuclear armed states cope with a key dilemma that's been created for them by the nuclear age. And that is, how can they still use their military capabilities to coerce their nuclear armed adversaries without triggering a catastrophic nuclear war? And specifically in the case of China, how can they gain coercive leverage against their adversaries if they haven't done what most nuclear armed countries have done to cope with this particular dilemma? Most states have either relied on conventional military capabilities that can achieve a decisive victory, think the United States in the post-Cold War era, or making threats of nuclear first use, like Russia, again in the post-Cold War era. But China didn't take either approach, which has generated a lot of suspicion that China maybe has a secret first-use nuclear policy. But I argue in the book that China actually took a third approach, which I call strategic substitution. And I'll explain in the next couple of slides why I'm using an image of a power outage over Manhattan to illustrate that choice. So at its core, strategic substitution involves threatening to use non-nuclear capabilities that can have strategic effects, which means that they can directly shape the behavior of adversary decision makers. Those threats are then paired with a nuclear posture or a nuclear strategy that threatens to use nuclear weapons only in retaliation in the event that a country is first attacked with nuclear weapons, often what's known as an assured retaliation nuclear strategy. And what this combination does is that it allows a country to increase the risk of escalation, including up to the level of nuclear war, without actually having to make threats to use their nuclear weapons. Actually, what strategic substitution is doing is placing the burden and daring an adversary to be the one to actually cross the threshold of using nuclear weapons first in response to these provocative non-nuclear attacks. And this approach promises to serve as a substitute for these two more traditional options for coping with the limited war dilemma I just mentioned, of threats of nuclear first use or threats of a decisive conventional military victory. But I do want to highlight a couple of things that strategic substitution isn't. Like, where do the bounds of this argument lie or concept lie? It does not mean that a country only uses these substitution non-nuclear weapons for coercion. It can also aim to use them for warfighting, provided that any conflicts between these two functions end up prioritizing those coercive uses. And here I'm using coercion to mean threats used to induce changes in an adversary's behavior, while warfighting means to impose one's will on an adversary using military force. Strategic substitution also does not preclude a country from building up conventional or nuclear capabilities that could enable it to select one of these two more traditional options for coping with the limited war dilemma in the future. The third kind of key idea in the book is that information age weapons can be used to implement strategic substitution because they promise to give states coercive leverage. Information age weapons is my shorthand for precision conventional missiles that rely on information networks to deliver these missiles to their targets, as well as counterspace and offensive cyber capabilities that disrupt an adversary's use of satellites or computer networks, including those that operate critical infrastructure, like the power grid over a major city like New York. Stepping back, what all answers to the limited war dilemma need to do is to give a state bargaining leverage, the ability to threaten to impose costs on an adversary as a way of influencing its decision-making. And information age weapons look promising for this role. The reason is that at least some of these information age weapons share features that enable them to threaten escalation and have strategic effects on adversary decision makers. Those features include Number one, that they can have large-scale damaging effects on an adversary's military, society, or allies that is very difficult to defend against. The second feature is that they cross salient thresholds in limited wars. And we can think of these as wars in which there are limits on the intensity or the geographical scope of the violence that are kind of tacitly agreed by the two belligerents in that conflict. The third feature, and perhaps the most important one, is that the use of any one of these information age weapons can increase the risk of nuclear war. And the reason is because they share important technologies that affect or are integral to nuclear operations. Each of these weapons can either be used to deliver nuclear weapons in the case of the conventional missile forces, or they can be used to attack an adversary's nuclear arsenal and its supporting infrastructure in the case of counterspace or offensive cyber operations. So taken together, these three shared features of these information age weapons enable countries to use them to threaten to escalate a conflict, including to the nuclear level, without actually having to use their nuclear weapons. But these information age weapons do need to be postured explicitly to create these escalation risks using a bundle of doctrine, capabilities, organization and command and control arrangements, and signaling to their adversaries. So I argue in the book that states can either really dial up these escalation risks using what I call a brinkmanship posture, that's like sliding down a slippery slope to the worst case scenario, or alternatively, countries can try to dial down those escalation risks and control them in what I call a calibrated escalation posture that's more like climbing the rungs of a ladder, escalating to the most intense forms of conflict. So like the nuclear and conventional options for dealing with the limited war dilemma, strategic substitution has pros and cons. It's not a silver bullet that allows you to solve all possible sort of issues that could come with coping with a limited war dilemma. And this raises the question of why a country like China, or indeed any other country, would prefer this option over the others, given that it is also comes with its drawbacks as well as its strengths. And in the book, I develop a theory of strategic substitution to explain why. The basic idea of the theory is summarized on the figure on the slide there, that a leverage deficit, the independent variable, initiates a search for coercive leverage, which is the mechanism of the theory, that results in the pursuit of an information age weapon for coercive leverage, which is the dependent variable. And if in the absence of that kind of leverage deficit being present, then the pursuit of that information age weapon for coercive leverage will not occur. So what do these terms mean? Leverage deficits emerge when a state's threat environment changes, for example, because of a crisis or a conflict involving an adversary. And that can reveal a problem, that their existing military capabilities are going to be inadequate for the kind of war and the kind of adversary that they're most likely to face going forward. And if they choose to ignore that leverage deficit, that means if a future crisis or conflict is to emerge, that country is either going to have to make embarrassing, humiliating diplomatic concessions or fight a war that it's most likely going to lose. So most countries tend to do something when they face with those leverage deficits. And when searching for additional leverage to redress these deficits, though, different priorities from other nuclear-armed countries led China down a different pathway to its nuclear peers. And so it ended up going along the solid line, going from the search for leverage to substitutes rather than the path not taken of those dotted lines towards adopting nuclear first use or a conventional buildup, eventually seeking that conventional option to sort of address the limited war dilemma. So what were China's priorities that led it down that different pathway? Some states are particularly sensitive to the disadvantages of the conventional option for addressing the limited war dilemma. Some are very sensitive to the disadvantages of the nuclear option, but China was actually sensitive to the disadvantages of both. It was conventionally inferior to the United States and doubted the credibility of threatening nuclear first use. So given these sensitivities, information age weapons become very appealing substitutes because their advantages are the exact opposite of the conventional and nuclear options. You can acquire information age weapons much more quickly than you can redress an unfavorable conventional military balance, and you can threaten to use them more credibly than threatening to use nuclear weapons because their effects are simply less destructive. After a state decides that it is going to pursue information-age weapons as part of strategic substitution, it needs to select a coercive force posture to successfully complete its search for leverage, so either brinkmanship or calibrated escalation. In the book, I offer some factors that might influence the choice among these two coercive force posture options, but I don't offer a theory as part of this strategic substitution to explain that choice. So I test the theory of strategic substitution using comparative case studies of all of the substitutes China pursued since it began to face the limited war dilemma in earnest in 1995. And I do both process tracing as well as congruence testing for each case. And I'll use this table, which is taken from the theory chapter of the book, to explain and walk you through how I tested the claims and how I ruled out the two most plausible alternative explanations, which are one, that China actually selected the conventional answer to the limited war dilemma, and the second alternative explanation is that theories of military innovation that focus on things like emulation or civil-military relations can actually explain China's pursuit of information-age weapons better than the theory of strategic substitution. So the kind of central event that the book begins with is the Taiwan Strait crisis, and it's there in the third column, right up the very top, the reason for the leverage deficit. The Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995 confirmed to China's leaders that they were going to need to prepare to fight a limited war on their periphery against a nuclear power with the most advanced conventional military capabilities on the planet is going to intervene. Before that point, there was some ambiguity as to whether or not the US might come to Taiwan's assistance if a cross-strait war occurred, but that disappeared with that crisis. The crisis, therefore, also confronted China's leaders with a severe leverage deficit. Going down that column, China then also faced a second leverage deficit that revealed even more extensive gaps in its capabilities after the US accidentally bombed its embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo Air War. And this event is something that China's leaders to this day actually believe was not an accident. So in each chapter, I trace the decision-making process in the aftermath of these crises that connects the search for coercive leverage to the pursuit of these information-age weapons. But my analysis in each chapter begins before the year of pursuit that's listed in the second column on the slide. I look further back to ensure that China's leaders did not face leverage deficits before then, which would otherwise have led to an earlier decision to pursue these capabilities according to the theory. And I also wanted to show that China had the technological foundation to pursue information-age weapons before they encountered these leverage deficits. So these decisions to pursue were not just driven by the acquisition of technology. Moving on to the posture column, which is the fourth along, I spend a lot of time in the book examining how China actually planned to use these capabilities, because an important part of my argument is to show that China primarily planned to use them for coercion, even if it planned to use them also for warfighting. If China only planned to use these capabilities or primarily planned to use them for warfighting, that would be evidence it was pursuing the conventional victory answer to the limited war dilemma, one of the alternative explanations. Finally, on the last column on the right-hand side, I paired each information-age weapon with a shadow case, a military capability that had similar effects and could have plausibly been pursued for coercive leverage. And what these shadow cases do is give us a point of comparison for what it looks like when China pursues a capability for warfighting, not coercion, both in terms of how they make those decisions, as well as how they end up posturing or organizing those capabilities. And the shadow cases do reveal some really interesting factors as to why China chose these particular capabilities as substitutes and not others, like China's strict civilian control of the military, something that's been very much in the news lately. That explains why China perhaps didn't consider special operations forces for strategic effects, because doing so would have required too much trust in special operations forces operating abroad beyond the careful eye, watchful eye of China's leaders. The book draws on a truly unique set of sources to offer very granular insights into decision making in Beijing, and I acquired many of these sources during fieldwork in China before the pandemic. I analyzed hundreds of Chinese language sources, like chronologies of military and political leaders' lives. Up there on the slide is the chronology of former CMC, Central Military Commission Vice Chairman Liu Huaqing, research publications of the PLA in the center of the slide, and biographies of decision makers like nuclear scientist and defense industry leader Zhu Guangya on the right-hand side of the slide. I also conducted interviews with more than 50 experts in China to inform my theoretical claims about information age weapons and also to add context to my empirical analysis. So I'll give you some of the highlights from those empirical chapters now. So the first empirical chapter of the book establishes two constraints on China's search for coercive leverage: that it was conventionally inferior to the US, and its leaders judged that nuclear threats would simply not be credible to a nuclear-armed adversary. And it examines three instances in which China's nuclear policy was debated, twice after it experienced leverage deficits in 1995-96 and again in 1999. But the first debate took place prior to those leverage deficits as the Cold War was ending. China's strategists were then grappling with how they would define the role of nuclear capabilities in the new local wars that they needed to prepare in that different security environment. This debate is already recognized in the existing literature. Harvard professor Alistair Ian Johnson documented this advocacy within the PLA of what they called a limited nuclear deterrence posture that would have increased the size of China's nuclear arsenal and added tactical nuclear weapons. But some of the more recent sources that I was able to analyze for this project reveal that China's top leaders also considered whether the US-Soviet nuclear arms reductions meant that nuclear weapons were actually going to become obsolete, and with raising big questions about how much of a role they needed to play in China's defense strategy moving forward. But ultimately, it was the advocates for continuity in China's nuclear strategy that won that debate. The quote up on the slide is the recollection of Qian Xiaojun, who is the former commander of China's nuclear test base, and he's describing the views of key defense decision maker Zhu Guangya, who oversaw China's nuclear weapons design work and test space in the early 1990s. According to Zhu Guangya, the main principles of China's nuclear policy were still suitable for its changed security environment, and they did not need to change. So the first information age weapon that China pursued was in the midst of the Taiwan Strait crisis in December 1995. And that was a conventional missile force that could hold at risk targets in both Taiwan as well as US forces in the East Asian region. When the US issued a visa to Taiwan's President Lee Teng-hui in 1995, China responded with missile tests launched into the Taiwan Strait. And PLA leaders in after-action reports about those exercises felt that they were pretty effective in deterring further Taiwanese moves towards independence, and they decided as a result of that successful experiment to build up a longer range, more accurate, and larger coercive missile force. But the reason why China actually had those conventional missiles to launch in the first place is a more complicated tale in which organizational interests play an important role. And I think this demonstrates the contingency that went into some of the information age weapons that China ultimately selected to give pride of place to in its strategic deterrence posture today. So back in the late 1980s, the US actually pressured China to cancel sales of short-range conventional missiles to the Middle East. The 2nd Artillery, which was China's then nuclear-only missile force, seized on this opportunity to find a role for itself in what a limited war that was unlikely to go nuclear. And the quote up on the slide there from Missile Base Commander Ge Dongsheng illustrates that these conventional missiles were a way for that military organization to avoid the deep humiliation or galling shame of nuclear weapons playing no role in a war of reunification with Taiwan, and hence that entire military force having to sit on the sidelines while the other services engaged in that important national mission of reunification. China pursued its offensive cyber capabilities for coercive leverage after the US accidentally bombed its embassy in Belgrade in 1999. So at that time, there was a pretty common PLA judgment that nuclear deterrence was not credible, it's not very useful, but information deterrence, which would involve cyber attacks against a more advanced and digitally dependent adversary, read the United States, would generate a lot of coercive leverage. And not only would it generate a lot of leverage, but it would do so cheaply and quickly by paralyzing adversary critical infrastructure networks. Initially, China's cyber force posture after that decision to pursue was made was pretty disorganized. It lacked oversight. It looked like a brinkmanship posture that was going to threaten uncontrollable escalation if the PLA used cyber operations in a crisis or conflict. More than a dozen PLA units were involved in cyber offense, defense, or intelligence, and China actually refused to officially acknowledge the PLA had any cyber forces whatsoever. It's the only information age weapon for which China also adopted delegated command and control arrangements below the level of China's top military commanders, at the very least in practice, despite this lovely image on the slide that appeared in the PLA Museum of Hu Jintao looking over the shoulder of a cyber operator. So this delegated set of arrangements became obvious around 2012 as Chinese cyber units or PLA cyber units were intruding into networks to gain commercial information, ostensibly without the knowledge of China's top leaders. And that delegated command and control arrangements became a problem as opposed to just an embarrassment for ensuring that China only received blowback for cyber attacks that its leaders had actually authorized, because at that moment, the PLA, or rather, as well as Chinese society, was becoming more digitally dependent itself, and hence the cost of any cyber retaliation from an adversary was increasing. China's leaders addressed this problem by changing its cyber force posture from brinkmanship to calibrated escalation in the period of roughly 2012 through 2014. And they aimed in doing so to much more carefully manage escalation that would result from the use of cyber operations. And by 2015, China was officially recognizing the PLA had a cyber role to play and had cyber units and consolidated them into a new organization called the Strategic Support Force, where they were subject to much tighter command and control. That Strategic Support Force has since been abolished with a successor organization known as the Cyberspace Force. I opened the book up with China's dramatic test of an anti-satellite weapon in 2007, which followed a decision a couple of years earlier to pursue counterspace capabilities, anti-satellite weapons to gain coercive leverage in conventional conflicts. Jiang Zemin's quote on the slide is as close as I was able to find of acknowledgement by China's leaders of that decision. You never get exactly what you want when you are studying China's security policy, but I'd wager that if you went looking for similar kinds of evidence among other countries that have pursued counterspace capabilities, you would also have difficulty finding evidence of those leadership level decisions, because few countries talk openly up until fairly recently about these capabilities. Chinese sources about counterspace capabilities are in many ways the most explicit about their substitution logic. In the early 2000s through to the mid-2010s, they claim that space deterrence is much more credible than nuclear deterrence because it's flexible, it focuses on military capabilities, and it does not directly cause a loss of life. But unlike China's other information age weapons, the PLA has always envisaged using its counterspace capabilities for calibrated escalation. And it made that choice before it even had the capabilities or the organizational structures in place to manage escalation as that posture envisages. It eventually achieved some of those capabilities and organizational structures after 2015. But US moves to blunt China's counterspace capabilities have really complicated this pillar of strategic substitution for China. The image on the slide comes from an article outlining some of China's concerns about the behavior of a set of US satellites that approach other satellites in order to kind of characterize and inspect them. In China's opinion, that's harassing its satellites. And this is one of a couple of recent US space developments that really concern China. China has been implementing this strategic substitution answer to the limited war dilemma for more than a quarter of a century now. China's leaders might see this novel answer to the limited war dilemma as being a success, a stopgap until its conventional modernization is completed, or a failure that prompts it to look more to reconsider that nuclear first use option. In my evaluation after having written this book, I would argue that strategic substitution has certainly succeeded as a stopgap, but it has an uncertain future, and I'll go into some of the reasons for that on the next slide. But I don't see China definitively reaching for the nuclear first use option just yet, because it sees strategic substitution as having been a failure. So there have been three main constraints on the effectiveness of information age weapons coercion for China that go to US responses, this issue of entanglement with nuclear weapons and information age weapons, and some uncertainty about whether these weapons can actually deliver on the coercive leverage they seem to promise in the early 2000s and late 90s. So to begin with US responses, they've really been designed to blunt China's coercive leverage. For example, I spoke a little bit about the counterspace piece on the previous slide, but the US has also withdrawn from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, citing China's conventional missile buildup and seeking to deploy some similar capabilities that may make that the coercive leverage from China's precision conventional missiles the victim of its own success. In the middle of the slide is an image of one of China's recent satellite launches that was for a missile early warning satellite. And what that represents is that there's growing entanglement between China's information age weapons and its nuclear forces that makes it harder for China to achieve this initial kind of goal of strategic substitution of managing nuclear escalation risks. China has been building out a satellite early warning system for its nuclear forces that it didn't envisage in the early 2000s when it started establishing this strategic substitution force posture. The final constraint concerns whether these weapons can actually do what China thought they could do. The jury is really still out as to whether China's investment in offensive cyber operations have delivered on their promise to provide coercive leverage. On the one hand, the US has moved away from seeing cyber operations as being able to deliver big strategic effects on adversary decision makers. And even PLA cyber experts have watched the Ukraine war and Russia's failure to use cyber attacks for decisive advantages during the Ukraine war and wondering what that actually means about the future of this capability. But China itself has been conducting what's known as the Volt Typhoon cyber intrusions into US, Canadian, and other allied critical infrastructure to pre-position malware that could be used in a crisis or a conflict. And that suggests the PLA hasn't given up on the promise of cyber operations for coercive leverage just yet. So to wrap up with some contributions of this book to the international relations literature, first, this book demonstrates how countries can use emerging technologies to plug gaps in their existing military capabilities. Not every country has the same gaps, so they're going to use the same technologies, often in different ways to different effects. And we certainly see this between China's use of these information age weapons and some other nuclear weapons powers. Second, it updates the literature on coercion among nuclear armed powers, which has been heavily focused on nuclear brinkmanship to account for both changes in technology and the expansion of the nuclear club to include countries that have no first use policies like China, as well as India. And in doing so, it's identified a third way to address the limited war dilemma alongside nuclear brinkmanship and decisive conventional victories. Finally, I think I would argue it's the most complete, empirical, and theoretically informed account of China's strategic weapons decision-making in the literature. The sources really offer an unprecedented level of detail on China's most hyped and least understood information age capabilities. And my hope is that the book is going to contribute to what I see as a need for more complete international relations theories that can explain China's behavior rather than treating it as an outlier. So I'll leave it there and pop up a discount code to purchase the book from the Princeton University Press website if you want to read more. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to Professor Nadal's comments and the question and answer.
Thank you, Fiona. Danny?
Sorry, the taskbar disappeared. Um, Thanks, Fiona, for the presentation, for summarizing some of the key aspects of the book. I wanted to first reiterate that everybody here should take advantage of the discount that Fiona is giving you and go buy a copy of the book. And while you're at it, go ahead and also Google Scholar, her other work. Aside from this book, Fiona has written a couple of excellent articles focusing on China's nuclear strategy. And one of the things that I think is a major contribution of your work so far that I wanted to push a little bit more is dispelling a lot of the mythologies that surround China's nuclear buildup and how American policymakers in particular tend to interpret Chinese nuclear behavior as well as its other strategic behavior in light of their own strategic concepts and their own sets of beliefs about escalation control, the utility of nuclear weapons, and so on. So one of the things that I love that you do in the book and your other work is really getting into how the Chinese are thinking about these issues and not assuming that they think about it in the same way that Western strategic decision makers and scholars have. So I wanted to start from that point of exploration of what exactly are these decision makers thinking about when they're making these decisions, right? There are a lot of assumptions about what exactly are they trying to accomplish, what are the objectives, right? When we talk about coercive leverage or deficit in coercive leverage, um, I think maybe you have in mind something very concrete that I think the audience might not. What exactly is China trying to accomplish? Are they trying to prevent American incursion into the first island chains? Are they trying to acquire territory by force? Are they trying to resettle their territorial disputes with its neighbors? Are they trying to revise the status of Taiwan? Right? It can be all of the above, and it can be some of these, but I think often here, right, over here on this side of the Pacific, there are a lot of assumptions about what China wants, and then we read what China is doing in light of those assumed objectives. But when you're talking about whether these decision makers now, in retrospect, think that these capabilities have succeeded in providing leverage and have helped them accomplish their objectives, they're probably using different metrics than most folks over here are, right? And we know this, and right, everybody has known since reading Brody and Schelling that we never quite know if deterrence is working. It's pretty much impossible to tell. So a strategy that is so focused on coercive leverage is going to be extremely hard to do good policy evaluation on, right? So it'll also be useful to get a sense of what exactly are the metrics. And then also, if you can, place this in the broader context of what Chinese coercive strategies are, right? And you're thinking about our mutual friend Ketian Zhang's work on economic coercion, which also has received a lot of attention in recent years, right? That we're focusing here on the military capabilities and military coercion, but we know that China so far has largely, though increasingly relying on military capabilities, has largely privileged diplomatic and economic means to achieve its objectives, including in its near abroad. Um, so I was wondering if you can talk about how the balance of incentives and the balance of capabilities or these deficits in coercive leverage might be changing in ways that favor more reliance on one versus the other. Um, and then finally, again, you can pick and choose which one of these you want to address. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about um, how much of these decisions, right? Because the way you lay it out, and it makes for very lovely reading and very nice theory building great graphs, but there's a sequentiality and an intentionality, right? That they first decide, oh, we have this leverage problem. Here's our possible options. Well, we don't really believe in nuclear deterrence. Conventional capabilities are going to be too hard to match the US on because they're too far ahead. So let's go with other stuff. And then we have to decide whether we're going to be more focused on escalation control or going to focus more on assured retaliation, assured escalation. But rarely do these things really play out these neatly and sequentially. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think these decisions that are being made earlier here are already informed by the fact that Chinese don't really believe in escalation control, right? There's um, this skepticism that again is very different from Western decision making. There's a skepticism about being able to very neatly control escalation dynamics, and how does that favor some of these choices that they made, 10, 20, 30 years in the past. I'll leave it here.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question. So the two outcomes over there, from brinkmanship to a more calibrated approach, right? The two strategies, like practically, how do they kind of manifest themselves with respect to China? Like, let's say, if there's a US attack, how does brinkmanship look like versus a more calibrated approach? Yeah. But thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.
So
Shall I answer?
Yeah, do you want to take a couple of minutes to address the questions while we wait for the questions from the audience?
Sure, absolutely. So I want to thank both of you for the questions as well as the comments. I'll try and touch a little bit on each of them, but I might just start with Professor Ong's question about the manifestation of some of these postures. The way in which I think that the Chinese literature sort of describes the way in which they're my postures, but postures that are sort of recognizable in the Chinese language literature, is for a brinkmanship posture. It's about a sort of having the maximum impact on shocking your adversary society and decision makers. So going after very high value, provocative targets immediately, like let's say your adversary critical infrastructure with a cyber attack early on in a crisis or a conflict, in ways that also may involve delegating authority to lower level commanders in the PLA, not the Central Military Commission, to kind of make that decision to go ahead and engage in that kind of activity without very high level guidance. And that sort of generates a more uncontrollable escalation process where China's saying, look, we can't necessarily, restrain our operators. We can't necessarily predict how these cyber operations are going to affect your critical infrastructure. We didn't do a whole lot of testing about it. And we also haven't told you where our red lines are when we're actually going to use these capabilities. By contrast, a calibrated escalation would start with something smaller. So it would start on either a less important, let's say, set of information networks, and a much more targeted and controlled disruption to that network I'm using the cyber piece here to sort of demonstrate the comparability, and with a lot more sort of clear signaling from China, both in advance as well as during the crisis or conflict, as to why they're doing what they're doing, and what sort of red lines have been crossed that have led to that undertaking, but would also ensure that cyber operations are only being carried out under the direct orders of the Central Military Commission and the top leader, and that the units that are carrying them out have sufficient oversight so that they can't go about using those capabilities whenever they want to do so. So it's using those kind of control mechanisms domestically to make sure that force is only used in accordance with the top leader's wishes, but the US sort of bargaining up the ladder until the two countries have decided, look, I simply don't want to go to a level of cyber operations that is that disruptive or that damaging for whatever it is that happens to be at stake in the crisis. While the brinkmanship piece is much more like, look, we're going immediately to the high level and you'd better stop bargaining with us in this crisis or conflict. Otherwise, we don't really know what's going to happen. With calibrated escalation, you kind of know where you're going and you're going there slowly. So you have a lot of opportunities to get off that bargaining chain. And China's become a lot more capable of doing the latter, that carefully calibrated set of options now, although they're still not sort of perfectly there in terms of the transparency piece. To avoid going on through too much of the question and answer, I'll touch just briefly, if I can, on some of Professor Nadal's, I think, really thought-provoking critiques and questions. I think that what China is trying to achieve with this strategic substitution approach is a strategy for strategic deterrence that, first of all, is credible, but secondly, that is appropriate to the types of local wars and limited objectives that it envisages the PLA would have to plan for in the post-Cold War era. It's very clear in China's military strategy that it's not planning for an all-out general war of invasion from a superpower, but it's about these smaller, if very, important high salience conflicts, but they're envisaged and planned for in a limited manner, even if it involves Taiwan. And specifically, this is about keeping the United States as the stronger conventional military power out of any crisis or conflict involving Taiwan. And as a result of that, also dissuading Taiwan from engaging in provocative acts as it did in 1995-96 in the views of Chinese leaders that would end up provoking a crisis. So I see it very much as dealing with these negative goals of preventing crises rather than giving China the capabilities to compel reunification or compel or to be able to actually invade the island of Taiwan, which requires a different sort of set of capabilities. I think in terms of whether we know that these things are working, as you point out, this is one of the perennial issues with sort of measuring the effectiveness of deterrence. I think that the easiest way to sort of discern some impact is to look at how the United States has reacted, and it has expressed serious concern about China's development of every one of these capabilities and has made major expensive changes like completely, re-architecting how its national security space satellites look, from big high value assets to lots of smaller, moderately capable, but a larger number of satellite systems. It has had an impact on arms control with Russia, as I mentioned, with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And despite the fact that US leaders don't think that cyber coercion through a big, set of coordinated disruptions to critical infrastructure is the way that cyber attacks have strategic effects, there's been a lot of concern expressed by US as well as allied officials about some of Chinese pre-positioning. So it's sort of in the reactions, I guess, that you see. At the very least, it's having an impact on some of the peacetime actions of the United States and its allies. Whether it would have that effect in a conflict and whether China might be reading incorrectly, where the US's risk tolerances would be if there was actually a crisis, I think is a little bit more difficult to tell. So I'll touch on those ones and just pause for the time being, but hopefully I can integrate some of the other critiques and questions that you raised during Q&A from the audience.
Very good. Let's take some questions from the audience. There's a question from King Mac. As New START is expiring, there is growing urgency to bring China to the table of arms control. The Chinese always point to the absolute numbers of weapons. Could you and the other participants talk about how these alternative means of deterrence that China and others are developing be counted in any sort of future negotiations or agreement?
That is probably the million-dollar question for how diplomats and arms control experts are going to need to think, in my opinion, about arms control going forward. And it counts not just for what China is doing, that I could imagine the United States would look at what China is doing in these information age weapons domains and be quite concerned about them. But China also has major concerns about the US's precision conventional missile capabilities, as well as US missile defense, posing a threat not of this kind of substitution and coercive leverage applications, but in China's case, they're very concerned about the US using those capabilities to destroy China's nuclear arsenal and sort of supporting infrastructure. So I think for both countries, and including the Russians as well, who have invested in some of these non-nuclear strategic deterrence capabilities, as the Russians call them. There is a very difficult challenge about drawing the line around which strategic capabilities need to be included in any future arms control discussions. The Russians already wanted some discussion of missile defense, I believe, as a follow-on to the New START treaty when it was negotiated previously. But the challenge that I foresee in this instance is going to be, where do you draw the line between cyber capabilities, precision missiles, counterspace capabilities, and even missile defense that is really about warfighting and operational effects, and the ones that have strategic effects, because that sort of line is quite murky. And I think you'll see all three countries perhaps willing to discuss some of the strategic level effects of these types of capabilities, but not wanting to compromise the warfighting advantages that they might be able to gain from something like, jamming each other's satellite signals, or very tactical levels of missile defense that they'll want to retain. And drawing that line is going to be tricky. And you're also looking at bringing in cyberspace and missile communities that have never been involved in arms control previously. Nuclear communities have been exposed to arms control discussions, including in China, most notably with the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty negotiations in the 90s. So there are interest, agenda, and I think organizational issues that will make drawing those lines to get an agenda on arms control, including these capabilities, very challenging.
Very good. Do you think China will seek other cooperation from international community? There's some typo over there, so I'm trying to make sense of it. Do you think China will seek cooperation from the other international community to improve this kind of weapon? And if they do, how will they do it?
It's a good question. I think that China would face some challenges in gaining assistance to improve their offensive cyber counterspace or precision conventional missiles from other countries, simply because China is pretty advanced with these capabilities, and I imagine would be a little bit hesitant to bring other countries into any weapons research and development that might involve them inadvertently transferring know-how to produce these weapons to other countries. And they also have some treaty obligations that would prevent them from doing so in the missile space. The areas where I could see most assistance China would gain from other countries really is in the resilience of its own satellite networks or its cyber capabilities. So that would fortify China against retaliation in kind, or the use of some of these weapons against its systems, because that's a slightly less controversial area for international cooperation. Cooperation on cyber defenses, cyber resilience, space defenses, and space resilience, I think, is a less controversial and less sensitive issue than assistance with developing the weapons in the first place. The other place I could see China really reaching for international cooperation is in thinking about any risk reduction or stability discussions that privilege China's interests in these domains over that of some of its opponents. And so you see this in how China has wanted to talk about norms in cyberspace, for example, in the UN, or norms of responsible behavior in outer space, where it is putting forward a treaty that prevents the placement of weapons in outer space that the US opposes because it doesn't cover ground-based capabilities, but it is sort of competing with the United States and its allies in that UN context to gain a greater support and following for how it would like to see these domains be regulated and governed going forward.
So we have a couple of minutes left. I want to kind of bring it to kind of everyday Chinese politics level. Before the seminar starts, we were chatting about the purge of General Zhang Yuxia, who is the second in command in the Central Military Commission, and almost everybody in the CMC now, except one lonely guy, has all been purged. So how does your research answer? Does it address that puzzle at all? And is there any implications for how we should think about Xi Jinping purging everyone in the CMC and the likelihood of China invading Taiwan in the near future?
So I think this is my speculation. I'll be very, very clear upfront about this because good information on questions about both Chinese intentions about the use of force against Taiwan, as well as intentions with regards to the purges of some of the top military leadership are very, very difficult to come by reliable information. But I will hazard a guess in two ways. One thing is that I would point to every single one of the capabilities that I research in this book, China's nuclear capabilities, offensive cyber operations with strategic effects, counterspace capabilities, precision conventional missiles. The PLA texts indicate that it is the National Command Authority, the Supreme Command, i.e., the Central Military Commission, that's going to be making decisions about using those capabilities. When it comes to nuclear weapons, it actually involves the Politburo Standing Committee as well, so having a civilian formal body approve the use of those capabilities. And when you have a much diminished Central Military Commission able to make those decisions, it means perhaps the top leader is able to make choices to use these capabilities more flexibly. But as I also point out in the conclusion of the book, even for the CMC, orchestrating the use of these very sort of high impact weapons with a crisis or a conflict going on at the same time, it would be really hard for one or even two people to do. And so the ability to sort of implement something like the escalation ladder that China is thinking about, that escalation management that strategic substitution capabilities equip China with, would be really, really difficult with a diminished leadership. And in addition to that, I think that carrying out any sort of a major use of force without having experienced commanders in the Central Military Commission, in an organization like the PLA, where there's a tendency to push decision-making authority up to the highest levels possible, I think would make it difficult to orchestrate that kind of an operation in the near future until there's other folks in there. But bringing it back to some, I think, core tenets of Chinese politics, one of my conclusions in the book that I didn't really expect until I had finished writing everything and stepping back was how China had selected information age weapons that enabled them to be used from within Chinese territory, and for top leaders to actually be able to exercise very strict oversight and control over the way in which these weapons would be used. Some other capabilities that would enable, for example, pilots of bomber aircraft to be flying off with these kinds of strategic missions were less appealing to China for both technological reasons, but also likely because the ability to control what those PLA officers were doing that could have a very high impact made Chinese decision makers more nervous than having things that were really able to have strategic effects from within China's territory on its adversaries. So all of that is to say that civil military relations and that strict control over the PLA shows up even in the choices that China made about strategic deterrence that I describe in the book.
Very interesting. So that's all we have the time for. I think it's a good place to end the seminar. Thank you again for Fiona and Danny for joining us. And thank you all for participating. And good luck with your book sale.
Thank you very much. And thank you both, Professor Ong and Professor Nadal. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.